Important analysis. A concerning time in the Middle East and for all those who care about Israel around the world, with Israel being castigated multiple times at the International Court of Justice. We're joined by a leading voice in international law. She qualified from Oxford University, clerked for the President of the Supreme Court in Israel, and she's a sought-after speaker who frequently appears on the BBC, CNN, Fox News and many other networks. She's also a part of UK Lawyers for Israel, a key ally of Stand With Us UK. She was recently honoured for her amazing advocacy and was chosen to light a torch in Israel's National Independence Day ceremony. Our guest today is Natasha Hausdorff.
That military tactic of using civilians as human shields to drive up the civilian casualty count, which forms part of their overall strategy of using public opinion and pressure on Israel to try and achieve its aim of survival. This doesn't happen overnight. It is as a result of generations of brainwashing, and I say that the international community is complicit in it.
Rather than an independent court here applying the rule of law, we're unfortunately seeing the exact opposite. We are seeing abuses of international law. Lawfare, which is in pursuit of a political agenda, as I say, where there is no jurisdiction, but perhaps even worse than that, where there is no factual basis.
We were told because Jews in the 20th century differed about whether the creation of the State of Israel was a good idea, that was a reason that Jews couldn't be anti-Semitic if they were anti-Zionist. Well, I urge you to consider a debate between parents, which might be entirely legitimate as to whether or not to have a child. There may be arguments for and against, reasonable ones. But once that child is born, to suggest that it should be gotten rid of would be murder. What we have heard advocated by the opposition today. And so I ask you, if you are, as Israel, liberal, care about peace, and abhor racism, you will stand with the proposition this evening.
Natasha, thank you so much for joining us on Stand With Us TV once again.
Michael, it's my pleasure to be with you in these beautiful offices in the heart of Jerusalem.
Absolutely, and we're thrilled to have you. And of course, you just had an incredible honour lighting a torch on Independence Day, one of the highest honours you can get from the State of Israel. What was that moment like for you?
It was enormously meaningful, not least because I was able to meet all of the other torchlighters and understand more about their backgrounds and their stories. And when we went with the Prime Minister, he said that this is the best of Israel, and I really felt that. So deeply honoured to be a part of it, and extremely humbled that everything that we've been doing for the last 10 years at least was meaningfully recognised. Very, very pleased to have been able to take part.
As it should be, and of course you've become an incredibly inspiring advocate for Israel on the global stage. We'd love to understand more about what drives you and some of the focus on your legal career. So let me ask you first, what inspired you to focus on defending Israel in the international arena, but particularly in legal forums?
Well, somewhat over a decade ago, when I was studying international law as part of my law degree at Oxford, it was already becoming apparent to me that many of the fundamental concepts of international law had already been inverted, were being weaponized against the Jewish state. And it was also apparent to me that what starts with Israel certainly doesn't end with Israel. So this process of abusing legal terminology like occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide, that this was becoming pervasive throughout, unfortunately, the legal academy, and that this was then filtering through to international courts and tribunals. And I fully appreciate that now, especially in the last year and a half, since the 7th of October, this has perhaps become more apparent to people outside of the international law bubble, but it's something that I was very intimately concerned with, I'd say for the last 10 years, and through the incredible colleagues that I have at UK Lawyers for Israel, we've been seeking to push back against that weaponization. We've been holding international courts and tribunals to account and calling for the proper application of international law to Israel.
And so in recent years, we've seen legal tools increasingly used as instruments of political warfare. They call it lawfare for a reason. Yeah. And so this strategy has been used to delegitimize Israel on the world stage, in international public bodies and forums. it is a modern battlefield. How do you think the state of Israel itself should respond?
It's a really good question. I've started talking about this in terms of the eighth front of this war. Together with the misrepresentations in international media, the legal misrepresentations here are clearly having a significant effect on Israel's ability to defend itself. This notion that Israel's fighting this war with both hands tied behind its back is unfortunately deeply rooted in the misrepresentations of the factual matrix on the ground and the application in particular of the law of armed conflict. It's clear that Israel is seeking to address that to a certain extent in terms of the representations it's made to the International Criminal Court, also at the International Court of Justice. But ultimately, it's only one voice. And there are very few allies at the United Nations that are willing to push back on those misrepresentations. Really, unfortunately, recently we've also seen the United Kingdom peddling in a lot of the misinformation about international law, calling Israel an occupier, even calling for the International Committee of the Red Cross to have access to Nukhba terrorists, which this is something the ICRC have themselves accepted there isn't a proper basis in international law for. At least their representative at the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Houses of Parliament in the UK acknowledged that these are not prisoners of war. And so the UK, in this respect, is calling for something that even the ICRC have acknowledged is not consistent with how international law applies.
How does this play out in the media? Because we see a direct link, I think, between the legal representations and how Israel is portrayed on the media. What is it that you've seen? And of course, you present yourself and present Israel's case to international media. What are the biggest misconceptions that you've seen?
I often encounter some hostility to my explaining, the application of international law, and I think it's because it is so at odds with the received wisdom and the agenda, the political agenda that has been pushed by the media. It's a strong way to describe it, but justified when one considers that, especially for the last year and a half, everything coming out of the Gaza Strip in terms of reporting has been Hamas propaganda. And the absolute absence of journalistic integrity in acknowledging that, the constraints that journalists are under, in Gaza, but also because of threats from Hezbollah against journalist colleagues in Lebanon and around the Middle East. The fact that they are only free to report from Israel without constraints, because there is true free press in Israel as there isn't anywhere else, unfortunately, in this region. That lends itself to the kind of distortions that we've seen across media coverage of the last year and a half. And there are so many individuals. I've been travelling around the world speaking to policymakers and officials and politicians, and so many of them tell me, well, yes, I'm basing my opinion on what I see on the media. And even, Lord Sumption, when I had a significant debate with him about the International Court of Justice Provisional Measures Order, which he was maintaining, had found that there was a plausible risk of genocide, and I was explaining had only found that there were plausible rights of the Palestinians that South Africa was advancing. He had also indicated that he was basing his opinion perhaps not on the plain text of the order of the International Court of Justice, but on what he was seeing on the television. And so it is pervasive, and it's an enormous challenge, not just for the State of Israel, but I think also for civil society. And I know Stand With Us does extraordinary work in getting the truth out. It is an uphill struggle, but I do fundamentally believe it's one that we have a very good chance of being successful in, principally because the truth, the facts, the historical narrative, and the law is very much on side.
Absolutely. Now, in 2025, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, warrants that Israel's actively appealing, citing serious procedural violations. Now, what's your assessment of the ICC's approach to both Israel and Hamas, and how do you interpret the broader implications for international justice?
This is a prime example of international law just being thrown out of the window. I say that for three principal reasons. This is a court that has no jurisdiction to have even opened the investigation that it purported to begin already in 2020. So this was under the previous prosecutor. She applied, Fatou Bensouda, to Pretrial Chamber 1 for endorsement of her decision to start investigations into Israelis. It's important to recognise that jurisdiction is what differentiates a court from just a political body. And the way that the ICC operates is that it has jurisdiction that is delegated to it by individual member states. Now, Israel is not a member of the ICC, and it has not delegated any of its territorial jurisdiction to the court. The Palestinian Authority is not a state under the recognised criteria under international law. So, truly speaking, according to proper applications of international law, it wouldn't be able to join the court. But the court sidestepped that and essentially accepted a number of arguments put forward by the previous prosecutor, legal acrobatics, as they've been described, to say, well, they should be sufficiently a state for these purposes. What that unfortunately sidestepped, apart from the fact that the PA doesn't constitute a state, is that the founding document of the Palestinian Authority in the Oslo Accords, this is the 1995 Accord, made it explicitly clear that the PA would not have criminal jurisdiction over Israelis. So, legally speaking, the PA cannot delegate to the court something that it does not have. That's fundamentally why the court doesn't have jurisdiction. There are far more additional kind of detailed issues that I perhaps won't bore you with, but it's this jurisdiction being thrown out of the window that is perhaps most troubling. Alongside that, a big second aspect of this is the court's breach of its own rules. Importantly, what we call complementarity. This is a court that is meant to complement domestic jurisdictions, not to replace them. And Israel investigates and prosecutes any credible allegations. That's something the court simply hasn't taken into account. But thirdly, and perhaps most shockingly, these arrest warrants were based entirely on false information. So the prosecutor very uncharacteristically provided a public summary of his application. UK Lawyers for Israel went through that and demonstrated on the basis of publicly available information that every phrase of every sentence of that summary was false. A lot of this was predicated on this canard of starvation, and every report from the IPC and the Famine Review Committee that predicted famine or starvation in Gaza has been discredited, and it is very simple to do so on the basis of publicly available information from COGAT and other sources about the volume of aid that has been going into the Gaza Strip for the last year and a half.
Let's talk about the kind of war that Israel faces and how that plays out on the legal arena. This is urban warfare. So Israel is having to go house to house because Hamas is embedding itself in civilian structures. So how does international law define legitimacy when facing terrorist organizations in civilian areas?
So there's the overall sort of wider arching legitimacy of Israel engaging in this operation. Now, the fact of the matter is Israel's essentially been in a state of war for far longer than the last year and a half with Hamas. But this is ultimately an exercise of self-defense in removing the threat, but also, of course, seeking to recover the hostages. Let's not forget the 59 that remain in Hamas captivity and the concrete war aims that Israel has been clear about since the 7th of October of bringing the hostages home and defeating Hamas so that they can never present that threat and commit the atrocities again that they did on the 7th of October. But when you get down to the operational activities of what Israel has been doing in Gaza over the last year and a half, there is a framework of international law, the laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. And one way of perhaps helpfully summarising that is that there are 4 key principles that any modern law-abiding army has to comply with. The first is military necessity. One can only undertake military action that is necessary to advance those goals, defeating Hamas, returning the hostages in particular. The second is that principle of distinction. So armies are meant to distinguish between their own combatants and civilians, which of course Israel does, and that the IDF wear a uniform, Hamas doesn't, but Israel still differentiates between those that it targets, combatants, and those that it seeks to protect, civilians on the ground in Gaza. One of the perhaps most misrepresented principles, the third principle, is proportionality. And that requires Israel to conduct a careful balancing exercise on the basis of the intelligence that it has before it undertakes strikes, weighing up the anticipated military advantage of each strike against the expected civilian or collateral damage. That's an intention-based analysis, not an effects-based analysis. And so it's really important when you hear commentators and even lawyers opining on whether or not Israel is acting proportionately. They simply do not have the information to make that assessment because they're not privy to the intelligence that underpins the proportionality assessment of each of these strikes. And the fourth principle, which is important to raise, is that of precaution. Precaution which prevents civilian casualties. And in this respect, and I've heard this from military commanders from around the world, Israel sets a standard which is significantly above what international law requires, but it's also one that militaries would find it extremely difficult to emulate. The warnings that Israel provides, the evacuation routes that it facilitates, humanitarian corridors, the targeted precision strikes. It's important to recognize that these principles Israel is applying, it is operating in a context which is unprecedented. The urban armed conflict where Hamas has embedded itself in civilian areas, has used every school, mosque and hospital as part of its terror infrastructure. And when I was on the ground in Gaza in September, we saw every civilian house in Rafah where we were had been booby-trapped. So that the only route to disarming these traps for soldiers was to destroy these houses. They were also fighting from individual civilian houses and using them as covers for tunnels. And we've heard a great deal about the tunnel network. The ability of the IDF now to fight through that is unprecedented, and I think testament to the ingenuity and the manner in which the IDF has adapted over the last year and a half to uphold these rules of international humanitarian law and to defeat, in many respects, an enemy that is using these rules against Israel and is abusing both, the civilian population, but also the laws of armed conflict themselves as part of its strategy to seek to survive.
You've represented Israel at the Monk debates and the Oxford Union, and of course on multiple different TV platforms. What surprised you or shocked you about either the structure of these debates or what you faced on the other side or from the audience?
I don't want to disappoint you, but I don't think, I've been doing this a long time now, about 25 years, and frankly there's nothing that surprises or shocks me anymore. Maybe some of the content that's come out of individuals outside of the context of these debates that unfortunately I haven't had an opportunity to address properly. I mean, some of the accusations that Francesca Albanese makes, for instance, are just...
The UN Special Envoy.
She's the UN Special Rapporteur for human rights of the Palestinians, and I mean it's blood libel after blood libel, which in many respects probably shouldn't be that surprising or shocking, because it's been the case since the Middle Ages that Jews were accused of killing children, targeting children. I'm afraid there's nothing new in these blood libels, but what I would say has been truly surprising has been some of the conduct of the media in this case, and as I say, the complete absence of journalistic integrity. And I'll give one example. Very early on in the war, in October 2023, the strike on the Al-Aghli hospital. I was actually supposed to be on the BBC, and I got a phone call to say that I was being bumped to run with the rolling coverage, that this was an Israeli airstrike. And the absolute refusal to engage with reason and logic, and my entreaties that they desist from running with a story that they had absolutely no basis to justify and no grounding for, and that turned out, of course, to be entirely false. I mean, the responsibility that media across the world had for riots that erupted as a result of this false reporting around the Middle East, elements like that have been truly shocking along the way.
And it was an Islamic Jihad rocket fired from within Gaza that fell on the hospital.
Fell short, as so many of them unfortunately do. And let's be clear, when Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets that are targeting Israeli civilians fall short and fall in Gaza, they fall without warning, without precautions, without a proportionality assessment. And these rockets have throughout this war been killing many civilians, most likely aid workers too, that of course the finger has been pointed at Israel, and it's part of the Hamas propaganda that the international media has been propagating, that Israel is held responsible for these unfortunate casualties.
Natasha, you were a superstar speaker at the Stand With Us International Conference back in March. You spoke to 650 plus students from all over the world, and I know they hung on your every word. We're speaking now to a Stand With Us audience, includes many young legal minds, also students, young people, and activists in general out there making the case for Israel. I wonder if I could ask you to turn to our camera and give them your words of inspiration about what they should be doing at this time.
So if you're interested in law or not, I would encourage you enormously to pick up the mantle, because I consider this to be the battleground, the eighth front in which every single one of you can make a significant difference, whether it's at your universities or later on in your workplaces or in media or writing to your local newspaper or your member of parliament. Correcting the narrative on the false application of international law is something that I know from experience that Stand With Us students are going to be extremely capable of grasping, and encouraging you all as much as I can not to be intimidated by the language around this or the received wisdom that has developed around it. I do think that you have incredible power to push back against these false narratives. I encourage you to use every opportunity to do so, and I know that Stand With Us is here to hold your hand every step of the way.
Natasha Hausdorff, thank you for leading by example, for your insight and for your outspoken voice in the world.